Hey everyone, welcome to Church Online. We are so glad that you could join us today. My name is Megan and I'm a pastor on staff here and I have the privilege of hosting the service today. For those of you that don't know, we are one church in 3 locations. So if you're ever able to join us in person, we would love for you to check out one of our campuses in Westland, Milwaukee, or Beaverton. In the meantime, we'd love to meet you and help you get connected. The best way to do that is to click on one of the links below or check out our website. Our mission as a church is to inspire people to know, love, and follow Jesus. We absolutely love our local communities and want to do whatever we can to help make a difference in the world as we learn what it means to follow Jesus together. I hope you'll find today's message challenging and encouraging, so let's lean in and engage.
Hey everyone, my name is Collin Mayjack. It is so good to be with you who are joining us online. I'm a friend of kind of the Willamette family, and I've had the gift over the last couple years to get to know some of your leaders. And the men and women who lead this church are men and women of character and love who I just have so much respect for. They've been incredibly kind to me. So it's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me and letting me be with you this morning. As a church, you're going through a series right now called The Greatest Stories Rarely Told, where each week you're looking at some of the unexpected, unknown, and even strange stories from the Bible and asking, what is this ancient, foreign story that is from a different time and a different place have to do with me following Jesus today? And last month, you looked at some stories that show us the value of sacrificial generosity. Then, if you remember, 2 weeks ago, Brian opened with a story introducing us to the value of radical hospitality. And my hope for this morning is that we can kind of take a step further in that value. But before we get to the Bible and the story we have today, I want to make a confession to you. So often when we come to church, it's easy to assume that whoever is on stage or teaching or kind of doing the talking is saying what they're saying because they've figured it out. They are the religious professional, they have perfected the art, and so now they're going to show you how to follow Jesus from the wealth of their experience. Here's my confession. As I prepared for this teaching, it was hard for me to not, at multiple points along the way, feel a little bit like a hypocrite. Because if I'm honest, I am not great at practicing hospitality. Do I have some friends come over for dinner or a drink now and then? Totally. But do I practice hospitality in the way that Jesus and the scriptures talk about it? Not so much. It's not often that I open my home to a stranger and welcome them in. I can't yet say this is something that I do. On top of that, I think it's worth noting that 2020 and 2021 have been some years of deciding and drawing lines for who our people are. We see something on Facebook or Instagram and Twitter and think, oh, I thought so-and-so was like me, but it turns out they're not. Or maybe the opposite. Oh, so-and-so is one of us. They think like me. They like the things I like. They buy what I buy. They vote who I vote for, and so on. Further still, the social isolation of the past year really forced us to choose who our people were. Who are the people that we'd be willing to meet with despite restrictions, or who we'd keep in touch with if we weren't seeing them face to face, or who we'd put in the effort to keep relationship alive when we didn't have kind of the normal structures for connectedness. So conscious or not, over these last couple years, we have been conditioned to draw lines for who our people are and who they're not. Yet, I think this morning, the gospel of Jesus invites us to be reconditioned, to follow Jesus into something new, to extend love beyond the bounds of who we decided are our people, and instead to learn to love strangers, chosen or otherwise. And in so doing, to find God there. In other words, the gospel of Jesus invites us to radical hospitality. And so at present, I think it's worth saying I am not a shining example of radical hospitality. I don't have a robust practice of hospitality built into my life just yet. But when I read the scriptures and I read the teachings of Jesus And when I think about the ache and loneliness and division and polarity of our current moment, I am compelled by Jesus' vision for hospitality. And I ache for that kind of life. And so this morning I come not as an expert, not even as a pastor, but just as a fellow human being who's trying his best to follow Jesus' vision for hospitality. And so my hope for this morning is not to teach you something as if I've lived it perfectly, but that hopefully we could come together and learn something together. Hopefully that sounds like something you'd be interested in. Okay, with that in mind, turn your Bibles with me to Genesis chapter 18, where we'll find our story for today. If you're new to the Bible, Genesis is the very first book of the Bible. It gives us the story of how God created the world and made it full of beauty and goodness, and how God made human beings to reflect that beauty and goodness back into the world. But if you know the story, rather than trusting God and his definition for what's good and true and beautiful, part of the human condition is that our trust has turned inward. We've questioned whether God is really looking out for us, whether he's really good and kind, and instead we've taken matters into our own hands to determine what is the good life, and the results are grave. And yet, you know the story, instead of throwing in the towel on humanity and kind of taking his hands away, God has set his sights on one person and on one family, Abraham and his family, who we'll read about today. And we don't know much about Abraham when we're introduced to him, but we soon discover that what sets Abraham apart is that he's quick to trust God. There's just something about him that's quick to listen and trust who God is. And so God's plan is to partner with Abraham and to partner with his family and to walk closely with them and to, through Abraham and his family, restore beauty and goodness through the world. So as Abraham listens to God and trusts him and follows him, that God's world will be filled with beauty and goodness once again. So God has called Abraham to leave behind everything he knows, the place he came from, to move away from his family and to go off elsewhere into the unknown. And God has promised him, Abraham, I'll go with you. I'll be with you. I will do the heavy lifting here. But Abraham is still in the uncertainty. He still is kind of in the mystery, and that's where we meet him. He's living in this new place. God has promised him a family that'll bless the world, but he hasn't had a son yet. And Abraham is pushing 100 years old. And so, as you can imagine, things are looking just a little bit bleak on the child-rearing front. And so it's right here in chapter 18 of Genesis that we meet Abraham. Look down with me at verse 1. It says this: "The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day." So picture this scene with me. Abraham is in the middle of an ancient Near Eastern desert. It's hot, it's dry, trees are small, shade is limited. Some of you guys know this weather from a couple weeks ago here in Portland, 115-degree weather. And so he's doing what any ordinary ancient Near Eastern person would do in the heat of day. He's taking in some shade at the entrance of his tent. And what happens? It says that, quote, "The Lord appeared to Abraham." So God shows up to Abraham in the middle of his ordinary life. How? Verse 2, it says this: "Abraham looked up, and he saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground." Verse 3, he said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat, so you can be refreshed and then go your way, now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered, "do as you say." So Abraham looks up, and he sees these 3 strangers standing in the distance. And his immediate impulse is to, as he's in the heat of day, invite them in to stay and to rest, to have something to eat and drink. Now, it's worth noting that in the ancient Near Eastern world, it was customary to offer any stranger who approached a dwelling the opportunity for rest and refreshment, to clean their feet, maybe have a meal. And so in a world of tribes and tribal warfare, you have to remember, this is the world Abraham's in. This was a smart move. This is a good move. Why? Because it was a way to transform someone who could be a potential enemy into at least a temporary friend. It's a safe move. You don't know whether these strangers are for you or against you. You don't know if they have a large or even a small army behind them in the distance. So a nice meal could just kind of grease the hinges in your favor. All of this is normal for Abraham and his world. What isn't normal is what happens next. Verse 6. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. Sarah's his wife. Quick, he said, get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread. So a seah is a ancient measuring unit, and 3 seahs is the equivalent of about 20 quarts of flour. Now, remember the scene. This is for 4 or 5 people. So for those of you who didn't get into making your own sourdough in the midst of COVID, this is a lot of flour. This is to make a lot of bread. So he tells Sarah, go get a ton of flour and let's bake some fresh-made bread. Look down with me, verse 7. Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice, tender calf and gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set those before them. That's the 3 men. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. So next, Abraham goes out to his cattle and he picks the best cow that he has and has it prepared for these guests. Now remember, getting meat in Abraham's world is not like going to Whole Foods or New Seasons and picking up your turkey patties or your tofurkey patties. For Abraham, giving meat to these guests was particularly generous. As meat wasn't found in the normal diet, it wasn't something you had every single day. And so Abraham presents this beautiful spread of cheese and bread and yogurt and meat, and he gives them a place to rest. And in so doing, he presents this extravagant act of generosity and hospitality, giving from the very best of what he has. Now, if we were to keep reading, the story goes on. Abraham hears from God again that he and Sarah are going to have a son. And shortly after, the 3 men in our story leave. End of scene. Now, the question is this. What is this strange story about Abraham and a few strangers in the desert have to do with following Jesus today? Further, what does it teach us about radical hospitality? As you think about our story, I want to bring your attention to 3 simple details in the story. First, the actions of the story, the people of the story, and then the context of the story. Let's take these one at a time, first with the actions of the story. Now, remember that Abraham shows hospitality to these strangers in the midst of his normal life. Everything we read is customary and a normal way to treat guests at that time. And remember where he is. He's living his daily life, resting on a normal day, maybe after some work. And rather than setting aside a special time for hospitality, getting out his Joanna Gaines Magnolia candles for entertainment, and putting on his party playlist, Abraham extends hospitality out of his ordinary life. He's open to receiving people into his home in the normal current of his life. He's willing to be interrupted. And so he offers an ordinary meal on an ordinary day. He was generous, yeah, but I don't think that's actually the main point. I think that from this story, we learn that radical hospitality is ordinary hospitality. A few years back, Rosaria Butterfield wrote this beautiful book on hospitality in which she coins the phrase radically ordinary hospitality. She writes this: radically ordinary hospitality. Those who live it see strangers as neighbors and neighbors as the family of God. They recoil at reducing a person to a category or a label. They see God's image reflected in the eyes of every human being on earth. Those who live out radically ordinary hospitality see their homes not as theirs at all, but as God's gift to use for the furtherance of his kingdom. They open doors. They seek out the underprivileged. They know that the gospel comes with a house key. I love that line. The gospel comes with a house key. Again, hospitality is not reserved for the superhosts, the people with the beautiful home up on the hill, or those with means, or even those who are just the best cooks. Hospitality becomes radical precisely when it flows out of your ordinary life. Next, let's talk about the people of the story. Now, did you notice the character switch? Look again at verses 1 through 3. It says, "The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre. And Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them. He said, 'If I found favor in your eyes, my Lord,'" again singular, "'do not pass your servant by.'" Okay, so which was it? Is it the Lord or is it 3 men? Keep going to verse 4. It says this, "Let a little water be brought, and then you may all," plural, "wash your feet and rest under this tree." And so the verbs, they shift from verse 3 to verse 4, from masculine singular to masculine plural. But that's not the end of it. Jump down finally to verse 13, and again it says, "Then the Lord said to Abraham." So again, this is confusing. Which is it? Is it the Lord or is it the 3 men? That's exactly the question we're meant to be asking. That interplay between 3 men and the Lord exists all throughout this passage. So you're left wondering who it is exactly that Abraham is talking to and welcoming throughout the story. What's the author trying to say? Somehow, in this act of hospitality, Abraham and Sarah are simultaneously showing hospitality to these 3 strangers and to God himself. That in welcoming these strangers, they are welcoming God in their midst. And so we can wrestle with this text and ask, well, what exactly is happening? What's actually going on? I believe it's intentionally ambiguous. The Bible is trying to get us to ask questions. We are meant to be left with asking the question, who is it that Abraham is meeting with? And to get the impression that, yes, he is literally setting out water and a meal to these men, but in so doing, he is meeting with God himself. And so we learn from this story that radical hospitality is the place that God appears to us. Hospitality opens the door for not just meeting with strangers, but meeting with God. That in some inexplicable way, when we show hospitality to someone, we are actually showing hospitality to God himself. The author of Hebrews puts it this way: "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have entertained angels without knowing it." Just pause for a second. The word used here for hospitality is the word philoxenias. It's a compound word from 2 words. First, the word being phileo, which means to love or to have affection. And the second one being xenos, or stranger. You might recognize it from words like xenophobia, the fear of strangers. And so we tend to think of hospitality as simply having someone over or welcoming someone, whether a friend or a stranger. Yet the very nature of the word hospitality in the New Testament has in view that we'll be welcoming strangers. That's what it assumes. So radical hospitality is the love of the stranger. To love someone different, strange, foreign, outside of our domain of comfort. It's the love for the people we do not know, who do not act like us, who don't think the same way we do. It's to make a home for someone who feels foreign, outside of your home. But why? Now, we would expect the author to say something like, God has been kind and welcoming towards you, so that's why you need to be welcoming and kind to others. Or he showed hospitality towards us, so now show hospitality. And that's true. That's in your Bible. But what does the author of Hebrews say? Do not forget to show hospitality. Why? For by so doing, some people have entertained angels without knowing it. That is the reason, as strange as it is, that he or she gives. Show love to strangers. Why? Because some people have done this and somehow, in some way, entertained angels without even knowing it. Now, remember back to our story for a moment. What does the text tell us about these 3 men? Almost nothing. They could be enemies. They could be friends. We don't know what tribe they're from. They could be from somewhere that has it out for Abraham and his people. They could be poor, or they could be royalty. We don't know. But whoever they are, Abraham doesn't know these men. They're strangers, and yet he welcomes them. And in that act of hospitality, the author of Genesis says, quote, God appears to Abraham. And so it is true that in hospitality, we find God, or God finds us. Each and every human life is a gift, a mystery, an image of God himself. And so when we look into the face of every man, woman, or child that we invite into our home, we, in some mysterious way, are looking into the face of God. Finally, let's look at the context of this story. If you know your Bible, you know that this story comes right before the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And now we don't have time to get into the details of that story because it's complex and it's a heavy story and it's more complex than we have time for. But suffice it to say that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is a story that raises the question, who is it exactly that's righteous? And we don't mean like holier than thou, perfect. That's not what righteous has in mind, but reflective of being in right relationship with God. And the story focuses on a character named Lot, two angels who visit him, and the people of the city. And what the author of Genesis does is he sets these two stories side by side, comparing and contrasting them to make a point. So let's take a look. So in the Abraham story, you have that the Lord appeared to Abraham, like we just read. In the Lot and Sodom story, you have two angels, two messengers of the Lord, arrived at Sodom. In the Abraham story, you have the three men who are it's ambiguous who they are, no context. And the same thing in the Lot and Sodom story, you have instead two angels, no context, nothing about why they're there. Then you have that Abraham shows hospitality and he gives to the three men who come to him. But in this story, Lot shows hospitality, but the city and the men, they do not. You have that God deems Abraham righteous, while the city is deemed unrighteous. Now, I understand that was a little bit of a nerdy kind of Bible dive. What's the point? What point's being made? The point is that the context of the story and its location right next to the Sodom story is trying to show us that radical hospitality is a defining mark of authentic faith. That the people of God, even in Genesis, always have been and always will be marked by hospitality. Put another way, when God's working through Abraham, he has in mind that it is the hospitality of the people of God that ultimately will save the world. That's where our text is taking us. Now, if you're up for it, I think we'd be amiss if we didn't turn to the teachings of Jesus on this. What does Jesus have to say? And so if you have a Bible, go with me to Matthew 25. Matthew is kind of one of the few biographies we have of Jesus. We have 4 biographies on the life of Jesus in the New Testament. And in our passage, Jesus is talking about his future return, a defining moment where, in his language, he'll separate the sheep from the goats. In other words, those who know him from those who don't. It'll be a telling moment. Listen to what he says in verse 34. Then the king, that's Jesus, will say to those on his right, those are the people who know him, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. And so what's their reply? What do they say to him? Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? And so naturally, there's this confusion. They've never fed Jesus a meal or gave him a drink. Jesus wasn't in prison. Jesus wasn't even on earth when most of these people were alive. So what does Jesus say to them? He says, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And then by contrast, he says to those on his left, those who don't know him, truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. Let's notice a few things about this teaching from Jesus. First, just look at the language. It's feeding the hungry. It's providing a drink for the thirsty, inviting strangers in. It's clothing the naked, caring for those who are sick and in prison. It's all hospitality language. It's all about the love of strangers and caring for their ordinary needs. And then next, notice how just like in our story that we read in Genesis, Jesus contrasts two groups, those who know him and those who do not. And what's that defining mark? Hospitality. What is the mark then of a true Christian in Jesus' mind? It's radically ordinary hospitality. Again, Rosaria Butterfield writes this: radically ordinary hospitality shows this skeptical post-Christian world what authentic Christianity looks like. And so if people you know have been left wondering, why do you do the whole Jesus thing? And Jesus just feels so uncompelling to them. I wonder how much of it is because they have not seen authentic Christianity through radically ordinary hospitality. But finally, and perhaps most beautifully and simply, let's think about our text and notice who Jesus says is the true object of our hospitality. He says this: whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters, all the hospitality you showed, everything you did for them, whatever you did for me. And so it's one thing to say that God mysteriously appears to us in our hospitality. It's another thing to say that when we pour a cup of coffee for a stranger, it's Jesus himself who will drink it. You know, it's one thing to say that in hospitality, some have entertained angels. It's another thing to say that when we prepare a meal for a stranger and someone who's different from us, that Jesus himself will sit at our table and eat. At the heart of radical hospitality is the belief that each person is to be treated as if he or she were Jesus. And so at the risk of being cheesy, I want you to imagine something with me for a moment. I want you to imagine in your mind's eye, and if you're the eye-closing type, go for it. That's great. I want you to imagine in your mind, Jesus is coming over for dinner. You can picture your house, picture the room, picture the table that you had set, the smells, all of it. And then I want you to imagine opening the door for Jesus to come in. Imagine Jesus. How is he? Is he hungry? Does he look tired or thirsty? Maybe Jesus is lonely. We read that in the Gospels, that Jesus often went to lonely places. Jesus was often lonely. How is Jesus doing? How might you welcome him if he were coming into your home? How would you treat him? How would you listen? What would be maybe the little act of extravagance you'd show him? Your favorite bottle of wine, your favorite dessert. What's on the menu when you invite Jesus over? Simply put, what would it look like to welcome him with radically ordinary hospitality? Sit with that just for a moment. Let's change the image now. I want you to call to mind a stranger. And we can use a really broad scope for stranger. Stranger could be a neighbor you don't know well, a coworker, maybe a refugee from another place who's moved to our city. Maybe it's someone who's on the other side of the political, social, or spiritual line. Call that person to mind. Maybe someone concrete, like an actual face. And now, like a video playing in your mind, I want you to imagine what would it be like to welcome that person with the same hospitality you would Jesus? How would you treat them differently if when you looked into their face, you didn't see an enemy, or you didn't see someone to dislike or a stranger, but you saw the face of Jesus of Nazareth? What would it be like to welcome strangers as if they were Jesus? How might that change our lives, the world, our neighborhoods? Further, how might you experience God in that moment? I've wondered as I've read this, I've wondered how many of us, if we're feeling like we haven't experienced God's presence for a while, like he feels far away or distant, that it may not be because we're not reading the Bible enough, or that we're not praying enough, or that we're not going to church enough. It might be because of our lack of hospitality. Maybe like Abraham, we will find God again over a meal with strangers who we've treated like friends. Maybe that's what's waiting for us. To recap, from the story in Genesis, we learn that radical hospitality is ordinary hospitality, the regular, everyday, ordinary choice to love strangers and welcome them. We learn that radical hospitality is the place God appears to us, that each time we welcome someone in hospitality, each time we welcome a stranger, someone who's different as a friend, waiting for us is the potential to meet with God. And in so doing, to actually meet Jesus himself. Again, whatever we do for the least of these, we do for Jesus. And then finally, radical hospitality is a defining mark of authentic faith. At the end of our lives, when Jesus sizes up our life, I don't think he'll talk about whether we went to church on Sundays enough. I also don't think he'll care that much how much we read our Bibles, or even whether we believed all the right theology. He will instead ask us, how did you show hospitality to the least of these? And that question is both beautiful and haunting. To close, I want to give us a simple challenge. I said earlier that I'm not an expert in hospitality. I haven't nailed this. And so as I read this rarely told story and I listen to the teachings of Jesus on hospitality, I feel both challenged and inspired, honestly. I feel this desire, this pull to lean into hospitality. And in so doing, to find God in the face of strangers, of neighbors. I want to live this radically ordinary hospitality. I want it to become part of my life, just as an everyday follower of Jesus. I want to open my life to strangers. And so I'm on this journey with you. But in an effort to work this into our lives, we want to move forward and make this more than a nice idea. I'm going to challenge us to take 3 steps in hospitality. And they can be small, simple steps, and then you can come up with them. But they can be inviting a coworker to coffee, asking a neighbor over for a beer in your backyard, or bringing dinner to the family on the block who just had a baby. You don't need to go from 0 to throwing like the neighborhood block party and inviting over your whole neighborhood. That's awesome if you want to do that. But my encouragement would be 3 small steps. And why 3 instead of 1? Not to overwhelm you. I say 3 because if we just do 1, it's easy to treat it like a checklist. Okay, a guy at church said, I got to do 1 hospitality step. Let me get this over with, and then I can move on with my life. Not that you would do that, just hypothetically, that you might treat it that way. But when I think about my life, I want more than spiritual checklists. I want to find Jesus in the face of strangers in some beautiful yet mysterious way. That's what I want. I want to be a part of what God is up to in the world, to be someone who doesn't just kind of dabble once or twice in hospitality after a cool teaching series, but someone who works it into the fabric of my life. That's genuinely what I want. And so my hope for you, my hope for us, is that we would take these 3 simple steps of hospitality, and the first might feel awkward or forced, and then the second will come and you're like, okay, this is getting a little bit easier. And my hope is you'll take a 3rd and a 4th step, and at some point look back and see that something that went from a stretch and a chore has become an actual source of joy in your life. That we'll look back and see that Jesus is transforming us into the kind of people who can see his face, who have eyes to actually see his face in the face of enemies and strangers. That's my hope for us. Let me pray. Jesus, would you give us eyes to see your face in the face of strangers? Would you give us boldness and a willingness to risk comfort, to risk our schedule, of our finances, to do to others what we would want to do unto you? Would you cause us to be open, we pray. Amen.
Well, hey, church, thank you for joining us online today. I hope that you enjoyed Collin. I know it was such a gift for us to have him join us this week as we've continued in this series, The Greatest Stories Rarely Told. He did such a good job looking at radical hospitality, and I hope we can take those 3 things that he mentioned to us and really implement them into our lives. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this. And if you are online, then you can see there's some links below about accepting Jesus. Or if you need prayer, we would love to come alongside you in that as well. Because as much as we love that you're online, we'd love to connect with you because we know that we are all living life and doing this to the best of our abilities. So let us know that you're there so that we can connect with you and help you navigate your greatest story that's rarely told.